So we have only about 10 minutes for Q&A. So in the interest of time, I'll let the audience get started with questions, and then I might jump in. Okay. So do you guys, anybody have questions for any of our panelists? Okay, Gord.
I'll go microphoneless. Gord Birch. I have a question for Karim. So the example that was given about being able to solve some major problem for a company, or maybe. So the fact that you can solve a major problem for a company by going to the crowd for a very low amount of money, $30,000. What's going on, in some sense, is a lot of the costs of solving the issue is just being displaced to the losers of the competition. So the company's not paying for it anymore, but somebody's still paying. So I'm wondering if you can comment at all about the social welfare of these
Right,
things.
so the question is about social welfare. This is a big concern for economists, right? Because what you care about is you don't want wasted effort. So what I would sort of say is that a lot of people come back with other motives to participate. So participation is a consumption good in many of these things. People learn, people develop skills, people develop signals. So in the context that I showed you for NASA, right? If you're number 11 and you're out of the money, you can still say your solution is better than Boeing, and you can convert that into a job with Google, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that happen quite a bit. The second thing that actually is very interesting, and I thought the direction we're going to go to is like, why the hell are these random dudes kicking ass for Boeing and for NASA, right? And I think what's telling me is that the baseline counterfactual software skills in most companies is pretty crappy, right? And when you put 100 people on a problem, right, you will just knock the socks out of it. And I think that's what we're sort of seeing, especially in the computational world.
David?
So the process of sort of crowdsourcing these ideas, in some way, aren't you just short-circuiting the traditional, startup venture capital innovation process that happens over a few years, and then ultimately you get acquired by a Boeing or a General Motors, and on some level, that feels to me to be a more sort of reliable route to giving the innovator the reward that he or she deserves than just running a competition where the innovator comes out, gives you most of the idea, but doesn't really get a substantial amount of the rewards from actually turning the idea into a viable business.
I'll get my co-panelist to answer, then I'll have a thought too.
So I think one thing is that we've often defined the notion of competitions on these really big, visible ones, right? Like, hey, makeup that clears your skin and makes you 20 years younger. Right, so that's, I think, just one very specific niche of what you could be looking at. Like for us, a large part of it is that the breaking down the problems is such an important part of the element. So, for example, we'll run between 5,000 and 10,000 challenges this year. The average prize is about $1,500, and so this is not solve asteroids. Even the asteroids problem is actually broken down into about 20 other sub problems. And so I think that's one piece of it, is that the notion of where it's the scope. We often kind of fall to the extremes and think about the really big challenges versus how do you break it down into individual problems. And we think a lot of the art is actually in the architecting of the problem to break it down. That's the skill set that we think is very difficult over time. The other thing I would say is that on just more generally is it comes back to the incentives. For us, developers are an interesting place because they're both social and antisocial at the same time. So this desire to have independence in action, but also be able to share when they want to share. And this independence is why a lot of our community members participate. They're not necessarily looking to kind of start a company, they're looking to solve a problem, and they enjoy that part of the equation. So it's aligning with their personal interests in a way that lets them express themselves when they want to.
I'll just add really briefly that I think a large number of this very creative people would either not have the skills or ability or able to make complementary investment, right? So for many, I'm thinking of examples like Quirky kind of, and the polymer. This is a question of whether somebody has a whole range of abilities and access to capital, and this is solving this problem for many people who would never have gotten out the door. So certainly there are rewards to the platform owners for reducing that risk.
Back there.
A lot of startups are trying to tap into the power of the crowds. What have you seen startups do that works when they don't have a partner like NASA, when they don't have some kind of huge partner that can reach the crowds so that it can work?
Yeah, I'll give you a perspective. I think I think one thing that startups. I mean, I think what's happening is that, like, if this was exotic and like rare a decade ago, now like everybody has a crowd strategy, right? You almost want to do that from like, you know, there's message boards to solve problems. Like SAP has a crowd strategy. You know, SAP has 2.5 million members in the community network. To any startup doing this. So I think in many ways, many startups are, you start with that default and make it happen. One mistake people do is that they go that somehow like there's no effort required to make this work. Like this is like, you throw the magic pixie dust of community and competition and all of a sudden thousands of people will show up and make it work. And it's like, no, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears required to actually get the community going, think of the right incentives, and actually deliver on something that the crowd needs. Right. The third thing I would sort of say is that many people are doing this task partitioning thing. That's saying, let's take one element, let's partition that out, and figure out how to use a crowd on that. But I'll defer to my.
No, I will just add a little bit that from the things we looked at, if you think about founders of startups, they're probably the most strong-minded sort of, they know the best way, right? So if in my talk I talked about not invented here syndrome, I would imagine that if they go for crowdsourcing something close to the core of their innovation, the chances of that paying off are very low. However, if you're going for things that are the startup doesn't see as core, or of course for understanding user needs, those would be the two areas. So you could believe that the power of user-driven innovation and us the users, and you could also say, tap into top coder for your software. But I think that for the inventions that is the startup, probably asking the crowd for ideas is unlikely to lead very necessarily to the results, unless it's the crowdsourcing platform itself.
Yeah.
So
I think the other thing I would say is our success, where we've had success with startups, has been non-traditional. Like Brevo Labs is a startup, and they're like, I know I got one great architect, and I know I can't hire a bunch of great engineers because nobody's going to come work at Brevo Labs. So the crowd became kind of a default option. Me included, my instinct as an entrepreneur is, I know two great guys, let's go build something, right? And that's the default behavior of a startup. The issue is that you know two great guys and you know what you're working on, so you've already optimized for the right people. But then what happens when you need 10 and 20 and 50? And so it's a different model of scaling. So our startup experience has been a lot when people realize they don't have the skills to scale in that domain. Because there is definitely convenience early on as an entrepreneur to have two people in a room with you just building together. But it's the question how you move from that. Big companies that are trying to be innovative in small ways or start these different places, they know that they're trying to become software companies. Like, hey, we're in 3D printing, but we don't even understand what that means for software. We build door security. They are really attractive because they know that they're going to have a skills gap and they can't compete with the market for the talent.
So let me just ask a quick question. Maybe Natalia, you can get started, and Karim and Narinder, you can pitch in. I mean, Natalia, you've been working on like outsourcing, global innovation for a long time, and now crowdsourcing. So, I mean, I've always been interested in the kind of industries that have been impacted by this, and on the other hand, that have not yet been impacted by this, right? So, I mean, you guys talked about many different examples, right? So, and going back to crowdfunding, Ethan talked about how medical crowdfunding is becoming the largest vertical, and I see evidence that real estate is becoming a new vertical. So can you guys talk about maybe like what industries haven't yet been touched by crowdsourcing, and what in your opinion you expect it to be coming soon?
I'll let Karim handle this one while I think.
So what I would say is that where do we see crowds perform first, right? It was information-intensive businesses, so software. Well, why software? Why Wikipedia? Well, because you can modularize the chunks, right? And you have various ways to test and assess the veracity of somebody's claim. That I've got a good solution. Oh, let me go test it, right? I can run it against a compiler. Right. The compiler doesn't lie, right? It tells you what's going on, and then you can say, okay, this is good. I'll take it, right? So in many cases, people say, well, how do you trust these guys? Well, you don't need to trust. Trust doesn't matter because you have other ways to verify veracity, right? So that's why, software was the first place where both, Top Coder as well as open source has done so well. Now, what's interesting to me, and this is back to the argument made by Mark Andreessen, is that software is eating the world. More and more, right? Software is getting into all physical products. And so the car company, right? What has Jay done with Local Motors? He's made the car into a software object, taken out chunks, and can now work independently on that and then print much, much later. And so I think what we're seeing is that as physical products can be abstracted, you can extract the information shadow of physical products, simulate them online. Biology has gone digital, right? Same thing, right? Then you'll see more of these things come together.
Okay.
I have something with you.
Go ahead.
No, okay. So I think one of the things I would say is when you talk to folks like Natalia and Karim, you get a sense of, well, this just makes sense. Why isn't everybody doing this? About 0.00001% of the world's software development is done through crowdsourcing. However, a massive amount is done through open source. And so open source actually shows this is a better way of building software. It's hard to debut. World's most used operating system, world's most used database. You can go on and on. There's actually, I think, no debate at this point that open source is better than any commercial model for building software. In some ways, I look at what we're trying to do with crowdsourcing is take the model of open source and put incentives to get people to work on it in certain ways. Businesses have benefited from the output of open source, but they've barely touched the process of the nature of how they work. Systems inside of companies take a long time to change. So we're really, really early and barely scratched the surface in terms of this going anywhere. And I would say almost every industry that we work in is starting at essentially zero. A firm or two is there, but we still feel like it's very, very early in that process.
Let me just add that I think the way Karim put it, that it was hard for me to answer your question because I see quite broad boundaries. And it is driven by information intensity, and information intensity and digitization is pervasive in so many industries now. I'm going to sound like economist, probably one of the few, because the more I think about it, the more I find evidence that the boundaries are often around IP issues and property rights. Because there are things where you want to reap the rewards, maybe back to the question of venture capitalism versus quirky, right? So there are places where you just have desire both by organization and individuals to reap much bigger rewards and to protect property rights and intellectual property. That's where it stops. So part of the polymer example is that, right? Potentially there may be people out there who invent something like this. It's just that that's not the right case for crowdsourcing, right? So even for cars, right? If somebody wants to grab that whole car and sort of make it their own, this would be the limit.
In fact, the car design is up as under a Creative Commons license. The entire bill of materials and the design you can download, but nobody's going to build it, right? Unless you have the skills to make that.
Sort of flipping that, it's basically where the pro-social motivation is the highest, you would see more of it. Whereas the private motivation is the highest, you would see less of it.
Okay. Fascinating. So we are unfortunately out of time. So let's give it up for the panel.
Thank you.